Hey guys, thanks for coming out here. This is a very fun panel with a really cool group of people. Understanding the enemy, I think if you look back in TV history early on, maybe it was not so murky of the good guy and the bad guy and who they were, and then we kind of morphed into more of an anti-hero era for a while. And these days there's a lot of very interesting nuance going on with exactly who are we rooting for, and even if the people that we're maybe rooting against, maybe getting to know them in a way we never have before. So we're going to talk to these guys about creating these characters and these worlds these days. Going to start out with a guy who has a long list of credits. We're going back to Star Trek: The Next Generation, a show my wife is obsessed with, and DS9. But then, of course, he is the executive producer of Battlestar Galactica, these days Outlander. Please welcome Ronald D. Moore. Next up, we got a guy whose credits include Dirt, Ugly Betty, but these days he's executive producer of The Americans. Please welcome Joel Fields. His credits include Falling Skies and Damages and being an actual CIA agent, but he is now the creator, executive producer of The Americans, Joe Weisberg. And lastly, I don't have to ask this guy a bunch of hey dude questions because he talked about him yesterday, but his many credits include Speed, Band of Brothers, but then he executive produced Justified. These days he's executive producing Sneaky Pete. Please welcome Graham Yost. So, Ron, I'll start with you. Tonight is the big Battlestar reunion panel, but looking at that show, that's sort of a great. It kind of goes right to the name of this this panel because Battlestar was reboot, remake, whatever you want to call it, of a prior series. And I think most people would say that original series was humans versus evil robots, and you could kind of qualify it as that. When you were creating your version from the start, did you know you wanted to do more with the Cylons? That we didn't want to be just evil robots. You wanted to kind of get more into the nuance of who they were.
We were sort of, before we even pitched the show, we started having conversations about the Cylons, and it sort of started with a production problem. How are we going to represent the Cylons in the show? In the original, they were guys in silver suits. And we said, well, the audience, in the 2000s won't really accept the same thing. So they have to either be super sophisticated, wild suits that we could create, or CGI. And both were sort of problematic on what we knew a TV budget was going to be. You'd get to build like one suit, and CGI was not at a point where it was realistic to have ongoing CGI characters in every scene. So we just kept talking and talking and talking, and eventually came around to, well, what if they look like human beings? And at first we were sort of, well, that feels too much like Blade Runner, so let's not go down that path. And then we kind of circled back to it, and once we started talking about that seriously, then a lot of things came out of that. We said, well, why do they look like human? If they were, once upon a time, if they were robots and they were metallic, why would they look like human beings now? Well, maybe they evolved themselves that way. Well, why would they evolve themselves that way? Well, if they were created by the humans, maybe they're moving towards that form. But still, why would they do that? Maybe they see themselves as humanity's children. Maybe they're trying to achieve something closer to what they think is God. Maybe in their philosophy, God created man, man created Cylons in order to supplant God's imperfect creation. We started getting excited, and so it all kind of came from that point. And once we had that sort of in place, we knew we had something really interesting to play with the Cylons over and over again, and that became one of the hallmarks of the show.
Mm-hmm. And then, Joel and Joe, for you, it's funny, I can, in my mind, see the version of the trailer for The Americans, maybe the version made in the 80s, where it's just the Jennings are the scary bad guys. It's like, it could be Stan's story, and it's just, they're next door, and they're watching him. But for you, from the get-go, once you had the basic conceit of, Russian spies living amongst us, we need to get inside their heads. It can't just be, they're coming for us, that we have to tell what it is that they are actually fighting for.
It's funny. First season, we actually went through a very conscious process where we would re-break every story in the writer's room as if Philip and Elizabeth were deep cover CIA agents in Moscow fighting for the cause of freedom in the early 80s. And we decided that we would only let Philip and Elizabeth in the United States as Soviet agents do the same things we would let those characters as CIA agents do for their cause. And that was a good exercise in the first season because it forced us to keep that perspective. And it challenged us to think about good and evil and bad guys and good guys in a different sort of way. And by the time we got into the following seasons, it was less of an exercise and more just part of the process.
Mm-hmm. You know, Joe, for you, because especially with your background, was it fascinating for you to, put yourself in the perspective of the other, as it were?
Yeah, I had an interesting experience, during the Cold War. I was very much a Cold Warrior. I really thought of the Soviets as an evil empire and even joined the CIA because I wanted to do my part to sort of bring them down. And my views sort of evolved. And one interesting experience I had was after the Soviet Union fell, a lot of former KGB officers wrote memoirs, and they told about their lives and what they had done. And I very much had this idea of the KGB as just a horrible organization that only did horrible things, everything about it was evil. And I started to read these memoirs, and they were really interesting. The people who wrote them sounded just like me and my friends who worked at the CIA. They were sort of normal guys who worked in a big bureaucracy and tried to serve their country. And that's not to say that the KGB didn't do some terrible things and didn't repress dissidents and didn't, whatever. There's a long list. At the same time, it was a huge bureaucracy with a lot of very decent people in it, many of whom did believe that, socialism and communism were a better path. And like the CIA, they sort of recruited people who were sort of social, outgoing people who could then in turn recruit other people sort of through their personality. So naturally, when you read these books, they sort of seemed like us. And I was very struck by that, and I think that was part of the genesis for sort of rethinking the idea that these were sort of. It made me realize what an incredibly unsophisticated, one-dimensional view I had of the whole thing.
And then, Graham, for you, I'm sort of fascinated by the path of Boyd Crowder on Justified because, sort of famously was going to die in the first episode, but then by the end of the series, that's kind of unfathomable because it's almost this yin-yang thing with him and Raylan. And look, we meet Boyd. He is not a good guy, and he's a neo-Nazi and all this. He's a criminal. He's a bad guy, but obviously at the same time, there's other layers to him. And for you, was that sort of a fascinating path of discovery on him, especially since he was only going to be in that first episode, and then realizing, okay, if he's going to continue on, we have to really add a lot of other layers to him.
Yeah, a lot of it was the Elmore Leonard tradition of if you really like a bad guy, then keep him around. Even though Elmore had killed him off in his novella, he did that because that's all he was thinking of was writing that one episode of Raylan's life going back to Harlan. So yes, the idea of keeping him around was a very smart one that we followed. One of the things about Boyd was that due in part, the writing was important, the directing and everything, but it was Walton, and what Walton brought to that character and how he made Boyd live. We would try at times to have Boyd do something horrible so the audience would be reminded that he was really a bad guy. And invariably, the audience would go, "That's just Boyd." It's like, but he just killed Dewey. I mean, Dewey, and it's like, yeah, that's pretty bad. But he's Boyd, And so it was kind of like, okay, we just got to go with it. And so we knew fairly early on that the series really came down to Raylan and Boyd. And one of the hard things for us was you have these two main antagonists is keeping them apart. Why don't they kill each other for 6 years? And that became the big struggle.
Yeah, imagine on the Americans, it's like, we'll stand and find out. Well, if he finds out in season 2, there's an issue. Where you go. For you, Ron, with your current series, Outlander, you've got a character with Blackjack Randall who is very despicable in his actions. And it's interesting because in season 1, we see just how far he'll go, and it's easy to hate him and have a lot of good reasons to hate him. But in season 2, without sort of letting him off the hook in any way, at the same time you showed more of who he was and what he might have cared about. Is that always interesting as far as keeping, I guess you would still call him a bad guy, introducing these other elements, but not going too far to say like, oh, now it's okay that he did those terrible things in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we talked about a lot in the writers' room was we just wanted him to be a human being. You know, it was important that to us that we not portray him as a monster that was easy to kind of dismiss and he's just sort of a one-dimensional bad guy whose function in the show is just to be hated by the characters. We wanted him to be human, and we wanted to have a presence of him that was an interesting echo of Frank in the 20th century. So you had this sort of triangle of Claire and the two Randall-men in her life. And like Walter, you know, we also had Tobias, you know, who really brought such depth to the role. And in our first conversation, when I first sat down with him when we were casting it, I told him I was as interested in the things that made these two men similar, that things that they shared, as much as I was interested in the ways that they were different. And he kind of took that and ran with it, so that there was a basic humanity of both these men who went down very different paths in their life, but you can kind of see that, you know, there was something common to both of them, and that, I just think, made it a richer character and a more interesting character in the show.
You know, on the Americans, you've got, you know, your definite protagonists, sort of, in Philip and Elizabeth, who have killed innocent people, who've done things that if you just explain them are like, oh, they're doing terrible things. Is that... And again, the show is not, you know, certainly a lot of the show is in fact dealing with the weight of those actions. So for you guys, is it interesting conversations for you about even like, oh, like how much is too far for the audience, you know, to see them do? Like, is there a line that if like we couldn't get them back if we saw them, you know, go that far?
I think we don't have to worry about that because of who the characters are. It's not a show about sociopathology. It's a show about being a soldier behind enemy lines, and these soldiers are, in different ways, both really passionate about their cause. And when you're passionate about a cause, you'll start to make compromises. But that's a universal human thing. You know, what you're talking about is so true. You know, there are not really bad guys out there who see themselves as evil. In fact, the more awful the acts, probably the more justified they are by the people who commit them. And that's interesting because as human beings, you know, we're tribal by nature. And one thing that binds and bonds us all is we all have a sense of where we belong and who the other is. And yet, ironically, it's the very thing that binds us is the thing that divides us, because then there's always an other.
And then, you know, you've got Graham these days, you're doing Sneaky Pete, and that's another show. It's kind of like The Americans where I could see the trailer for the version of Sneaky Pete that's the guest. You know, it's like he came into their lives, and you know, and so yeah, is that kind of the fun, that flipping of perspective and saying, okay, you know, there's that version of the story. Now let's tell like who is this guy, and you know, maybe he's not that much of a murderous sociopath, but what would motivate someone to do something like that?
You know, it's funny, and I think we probably all share this. You get so far involved inside the character and in the story that you sometimes forget. So people would come up to me and say, yeah, I didn't know if I wanted to watch that show because it's about a bad guy. It's like, oh, that's right, he is a bad guy. Oh, I kind of forgot because, you know, we're involved in his story and what he's trying to accomplish. I think we're also, you know, again, gifted with having Giovanni Ribisi, who can just be this bad guy who also, you get a sense, wants to be better. And I think that, you know, Bryan Cranston's original pitch for the show, or his tagline for it, was breaking good. And that it is a character who's slowly, we hope, over time, getting better. But we also love having this con artist because you never quite know why he's doing something. And if you think that he's doing something out of the goodness of his heart, it's also because there's probably money in it for him or some advantage. I will say I went back to Toronto for a high school reunion of a significant number that I won't share. And a friend there is the Canadian equivalent of a prosecutor. He's a Crown attorney. And I said I was working on a show about a con artist, and his face just dropped. He said, oh, they're the worst. He said, oh, no, they're worse than murderers. He said, most murderers, they're not setting out, you know, let's say a hitman, which really kind of only exists. But he said, you know, it's something bad happens, someone gets killed, it's awful. But con artists, I mean, con people, they're setting out to destroy people's lives, and they have absolutely no concern for them. I was like, yeah, okay, well, not our guy.
He'd make you change your mind. I asked this question sort of specifically about the Jennings, but for all of you, do you have that question about, how far is too far, especially as far whether you consider the character the protagonist or the antagonist, wanting to make sure that the audience sort of doesn't either check out or not even want to see that person on screen. It's like, do you have those conversations about, how can we sort of, no pun intended, justify what's about to happen here?
I find we have those conversations a lot with the studio, the network. Like that's an ongoing. There's a deep-seated fear in the executive suites that the audience won't like them anymore if they do this. But somehow in the writers' room we don't care, and you just keep going. And I guess to me, after watching the first season of Sopranos, I went, the sky's the limit. You can push a character so far and can do the most horrendous things. Can take his daughter out to look at colleges and kill guys in the afternoon and then get back in the car with her and just do unbelievable things, and the audience still likes him. So you can go you can go much further than you think you can, but the studios and the networks are terrified of exactly what you're talking about.
Right. I think about on the Americans, even getting the body in the suitcase, which, but it's like, I still love Philip,
Yeah, I mean, for us, I remember season 1 in one of our I think it was our second or third episode, Philip and Elizabeth poison a completely innocent teenager because his mother was Caspar Weinberger's housekeeper, and then they will or won't give him the antidote so that he lives or dies. And that was the last time we ever worried about it. It was so early in the show, we didn't know if we would have any audience at all. And we thought, what if the little audience we have, we're going to lose that audience and be canceled? But essentially, that's a neurotic fear. Once you have an audience and they're enjoying all that stuff you do, and we never worried about it after that, because essentially the story we're telling is these people do these horrible, horrible, horrible things. They're all just different gradations of horrible. And then Philip feels badly about him. And that's the story we're telling. He feels badly. She doesn't seemingly feel badly at all, but maybe stuff is going on under the surface. That's our whole show. That's what it's about.
Graham, have you had those conversations? I mean, you mentioned stuff like, Boyd killing Dewey, but where you're always like, kind of curious how this will go over, whether it be with the audience or the studio.
I'm sure we had those conversations. I think that, it brings up stuff thinking about Sneaky Pete and the character of Marius, and that I think we have a natural inclination that we don't want to see him, cheating a widow out of her out of her money. That we're not interested, perhaps, in the stories where Marius is doing what a lot of con artists do, which is really ruin people's lives. He has much more of a targeted agenda that involves usually, so far, sticking it to the bad guy, someone who's worse than he is. And maybe I'm being too soft on it. Maybe we really have to go and see him do horrible things to people so I can feel better part of this panel.
Oh my God, in season 3, what he did.
This is the moment where it all turned.
Right. Ron, for you on Battlestar, if you look back at like the miniseries, I mean, we meet Six and she snaps a baby's neck, and then they pretty much kill most of humanity. Was it interesting for you to see how the audience could, I think by the end a lot of people were very invested in Six as a character, and to see that that for what might seem in the initial viewing as, oh, that's the most despicable character, by the end you could have a completely different perspective on?
Well, it's because you've gone on a journey with her and you've gotten to know her and you've gotten to know various other copies of Sixes, and by the end of the series we had spent a lot more time in the Cylon world than I even really anticipated, in season 1, because in season 1 they were still very much the other and the enemy and kept them at a distance, and you were getting to know them in bits and pieces and over time. But there really was, like so many things on Battlestar, there really wasn't a master plan to do that, to or to swap the Sharons, or to have one Sharon go bad and the other Sharon go good, or any of those kinds of things. They sort of happened improvisationally in the writers' room as we went through the process. And part of the process of just getting to know a character, on a weekly basis on a TV show, is you just start to invest yourself in them, regardless of what they're doing. They're part of the family of characters that you come to know, and you start to like them, by even without trying to.
With the Americans, I'm actually curious, what Ron was saying about, spending more time with the Cylons than he knew initially would happen. Obviously from the start, our perspective is with these Russian characters amongst us. But did you know that, say, Nina and Oleg, and that part of the show would become as big a part of the show as it did? And these characters that are part of the spy world, but maybe not having to kill people. So we're getting to see a different perspective there.
Well, I think we knew it would be part of the show, but I think what was a total surprise to us was that we would go back to Russia and spend time with those people in the Soviet Union. If you had asked us, we would have said that's not in the plans, and we don't even see how that could happen. And then as the stories developed, suddenly we saw an opportunity for that, and we jumped at it. We thought this show in its DNA is a show about the United States and the Soviet Union, and here's a chance to go back with Oleg and show him and his family, these people who are sort of part of the upper ruling elite of the Soviet Union. When do you ever get a chance to tell stories about that on American television? It's such an interesting opportunity. Let's see where it goes. And at the same time, you're talking about the enemy and how we see the KGB as sort of evil in every way, which we've been working against the whole show. Well, here's this thing we discovered, that at this exact time in history, the KGB was working to uproot this corruption. Corruption was so rampant in the Soviet Union and all the different parts of the bureaucracy, except the KGB had mostly been free of corruption. So the party was corrupt, the military was corrupt, the government was corrupt, everything was corrupt. The KGB, incredibly enough, had kept itself mostly uncorrupt, and they realized that corruption was maybe going to destroy the whole country. So they had started taking on, in particular, the food organizations in Moscow, which were incredibly corrupt, and they were just, as a type of law enforcement activity, going to fight it. And we thought, well, let's tell that story. It's something actually really good they were trying to do to save their country, and we can put Oleg in the middle of it. It shows the KGB in a positive light, which, because we're odd, we want to do that. And it'll be just a completely unusual story to tell, and at the same time, we can show him and his family there. So we just kind of leapt at that opportunity. By the way, if you saw Vladimir Putin interviewed by Charlie Rose, this is an example of the same thing about the enemy. Charlie Rose said to him, people here think of you as this sort of kleptocrat, that you have billions of dollars hidden, that all you've done is steal money. And he said, how could anybody think that? I come from the KGB. And that's what, I'm not passing any judgment on what is or isn't true, but I'm trying to say that's what he was talking about. He was saying, I come from a tradition of the one organization in this country that wasn't corrupt, so I'm not corrupt.
Graham, interesting thing with Justified was, while Boyd was kind of your constant, and as you said, you had to kind of keep him at arm's length from Raylan for obvious reasons, you did have sort of season-long antagonists along the way. And so when you're creating something like that, like, the Bennetts, and when you're creating Quarles, their time on the show will be limited, but at the same time you want them to be multi-dimensional. So how much do you think about making sure you have those touches, and that even if they're going to be, I guess, a little more outwardly the villain of the season, that we're still seeing what pushes them, what motivates them?
Well, that was always the goal. I think some we did better than others. I think Quarles, we probably didn't go into deeply enough to really find out what made him tick. He was just this really messed up guy. But we had Neil McDonough playing him, and he was so captivating that we were able to run with that. I think our biggest success would be Mags Bennett. And everyone nods. Yeah, that's it. Margot, done. But that was one of those things. And I mean, one of the things you're hearing in common here is how stories evolve, and you don't know exactly where it's going to go. And for us, we had envisioned season 2 being about feud, and that the antagonist would be a female villain. And initially, FX was concerned about her having enough badassery, as it were. And so that's when we came up with the poisoning scene at the end of the first season of the first episode of the second season. And the other thing, though, was casting Margot. And I remember I was in the writer's office, and Adam Arkin had directed that episode, and he came down and he grabbed Fred Golan and Sarah Timmerman and myself, and he said, I want to show you something. And he showed us the poisoning scene. And after we looked at each other and said, well, we've got a season. And it's just that feeling of, okay, now we can write to her and find out more about her. And then the other key thing, though, for that season was Caitlin Dever, who played Loretta. And casting a young actress you don't know, or it's time to go. No, it's not. We are going to end a few minutes early because we have to run to the airport. But we lucked out with Caitlin. We didn't know if she was going to just be okay and we would write her out and maybe bring her back at the end of the season. She turned out to be tremendous. And so that then developed this relationship between Mags and Loretta, which became one of the spines of the season. And that really helped humanize Mags. And also the relationship with her sons really helped too. That really made her this rounded person. Just in that regard, just one quick thing. Sometimes it can feel like we're doing a public service announcement, the more you know. But the reality is, the more you know about these characters, the more you get invested in them. And think, one of my favorite transformations over time is Jaime Lannister on Game of Thrones. In that first episode, he pushes Bran out the window. And I remember, by the way, I wasn't going to watch that show, and it was my son who talked me into watching it. That's when I got hooked. It's like, well, if they're going to do that, if they're going to push that kid out the window, I'm in. Which really shows you way more than you want to know about me. My wife is out there going, oh, Jesus, yeah. But then the progression of Jaime over the years is wonderful. The downside can be, in the later years of MASH, everyone was a good guy. Hot Lips was, suddenly, she was a good friend of Hawkeye. And it's like, oh, okay.
But I understand. You raise a really interesting process question from a writing standpoint for all of us, which is there's something very easy in life about having a good guy and a bad guy. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, we can fight the war. And there's something very easy in writing about having a very clear good guy and bad guy. That scene suggests itself, right? Whatever it is. You could just say good guy, bad guy, and any of us could write a couple pages. And there's a challenge when things get a lot more complicated. It's a life challenge, and there's a writing challenge. But on the other side of that writing is something, on the other side of that challenge is something much better, and actually, ultimately, I think much easier, because it becomes richer, and there's just a lot more to explore when you see more sides of things.
You actually opened up a topic I was going to ask about next, which is the redemptive arc. We talked about how Sneaky Pete, you kind of knew from the get-go that there's a bit of that, but do you guys find yourself having to decide? Because there's some shows I loved where I thought maybe they redeemed one too many characters, and maybe that, like, oh, maybe that guy shouldn't have gotten redeemed at the end. So do you think when you start out with a character doing really bad things, you want to make sure that they're a three-dimensional person and not just the bad guy, but then do you have to decide, like, but are they really going to change, or are we just going to understand? Do you guys have that conversation, or maybe you've gone too far and people are rooting for someone they shouldn't root for almost?
Yeah, I'll tell you with Boyd Crowder, ultimately at the end, yes, he changed a little bit, but ultimately our feeling was that in Elmore's world, characters don't change very much, maybe the tiniest amount. And we were going to reserve that for Raylan, for our hero, that he would evolve just this little bit by the end of the series. But Boyd ultimately was a sociopath who didn't know he was a sociopath and wanted to pass as a regular human being. Sort of that was his goal. But he really didn't have it. It was a struggle for him. And he pinned everything as his redemptive thing on his love for Ava. But when it came right down to it, a lot of it, there was a line early on where someone asked Raylan, is Boyd telling the truth, when he had a conversion to being a man of God? And he said, I don't believe it, but I believe that he believes it. And so I think that characters can change and they can be redeemed perhaps, but you really have to watch it, because people ultimately, even our characters in our shows, they're not going to change that much.
And I think it can be damaging if you go too far in that direction. I mean, I'll admit, I came to The Americans late because I had sort of an instinctive prejudice against the promos of it. I was like, really? It's going to be KGB, and they're just going to be the nicest darn KGB agents, and they're going to, I know what this show is going to be. They're going to play a lot of 80s music, and then, these guys are going to be they're not really KGB. They actually love America, and they're going to save us every week. And I was like, I'm not watching that fucking show. And then I was reading, everyone and their brothers telling me that this is a great show, and you're a moron for not watching it. And so I started watching it, and I was like, wow, they really mean it. I mean, these guys they're not like, at first I was like, okay, I'm on the lookout for any kind of redemptive arc here that's gonna, they're gonna realize Reagan's not that bad a guy, and I like McDonald's, or, we're just gonna go down that road. But no, part of the beauty of that series is just how completely seriously they take their mission, and that they are true patriots, and they really buy in. And then you as an audience member find yourself buying into this crazy thing that you think at the outset. But it is a danger, I think. Sometimes it's seductive to just like take all the teeth out of your bad guys and just decide, oh, they're just lovable lugs, and let's just play them that way.
Yeah, on the Americans, I almost kind of take note of you guys kind of make sure not to go too long, without having them do something that is, just a terrible act that, again, it's not treated like they don't care, but that it's still like they have to do it. And is that important for you guys because you can't, have 3 years of the show go by and be like, oh, well, they just snuck some files out, nothing bad happened.
Well, I think the danger is what both Ron and Graham were both talking about is really the danger is being false. Yeah. So, in real life, I'm sure we all know a lot of people who have changed considerably and a lot of people who we've known for years who haven't changed at all. And that's why you can have TV shows that have characters who have changed just a tiny bit or not at all, and some who have gone through tremendous change. And what we're dealing with, we have two main characters, Philip and Elizabeth, and we're constantly talking about calibrating their changes against each other. So Philip has changed considerably over the 5 seasons of the show, and Elizabeth has changed maybe just a teeny tiny little bit. And as we approach the final season, we're talking a lot about how to wrap that up and where it's going to land. And the thing that we most want to do is just have it feel real.
For all you guys, as we're talking about this, I'm just curious, were there characters that, you kind of loved in other fiction that sort of nailed what we're talking about here? The idea of the well-rounded antagonist, as it were, a character where you're like, okay, that's a fascinating. He's the other, he's the villain, but I still find that I'm fascinated by him.
Well, I'll say two, one from fiction and one from reality in my childhood. For fiction, Richard III. How can you not love that guy, right? And I'll tell a quick story from my childhood. When I was a kid, I lived in Israel for a couple of years with my family. And while I was there, Anwar Sadat came to Israel. Now, I was 11 years old. And I remember sitting in the living room in our little tiny house near the beach in Netanya, and I was watching this fuzzy black and white TV with rabbit ears. And Anwar Sadat was the enemy. He represented a country that had invaded 3 years earlier to destroy everybody, push the people into the sea was the stated goal. He got off the plane and he waved. And he walked down the stairs and he walked past this line of Israeli soldiers. And he got to the end of the line of Israeli soldiers and he saluted them. And I'm telling you, if Mickey Mouse had gotten off that plane and saluted those soldiers, it would have been no less weird to me. And that was a transformative moment for me, because if that guy wasn't a monodimensional enemy, then maybe the whole thing had to be rethought. So there are my two.
Anyone else?
Well, I mean, we're talking about characters that are that we get to know better and we get to understand them and we're understanding the enemy. I in no way understand Hans Gruber in Die Hard, but he's a great
He wanted the
bad
bonds.
guy.
He wanted the bonds.
I give you the FBI. And I think of some of the bad guys they're just straight up bad. Right. The first couple seasons of the British Sherlock, I don't know exactly why Moriarty is the way he is, but oh my God, I love to watch him.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, bring up Die Hard for that reason of that weird, like, I'm almost rooting for Hans, even though I should. I guess that's, even what we're talking about, like, even if someone is, at the end of the day, what we would decree bad, that you certainly want your viewers to care about the time you're spending on screen, right? I'm sure that's the goal. What about you, Ron?
I think, I just had a sort of a tangential thought is that, I'm probably one of the few people that doesn't really like the ultimate arc of Darth Vader, in the Star Wars trilogies. I thought it was one of the great. It's obviously one of the great cinematic villains of all time. An amazing costume, very nicely underwritten, unbelievable voice from James Earl Jones. The whole presence of it. I mean, he's like the definition of villain now is Darth Vader, right? And then you get to the third movie, and you take off the mask, and he's Uncle Fester, and it's like. And I sort of remember I was really disappointed by that as a kid. Or not a kid, I was in college. And it still kind of bums me out when I get to that part of when I watch it with my children, that here was this great villain that was dark, had gone down incredibly dark roads, and you were terrified of him. And yeah, it was fascinating that he was Luke's father and all this. But then at the end, we had to sort of, but darn it, he's just going to turn around and he's going to throw that old emperor down the chute, and and then he's Uncle Fester, and it's just like, and then he gets to live with Yoda, and somehow he killed billions of people, but that's okay, because it's like heaven in the Star Wars universe is a very interesting concept. So
I'm gonna go to audience questions in a minute, but one last person here, if you want to answer.
Well,
Joe?
I'm just going to go all the way to the ultimate bad guy. I recently read a kind of revisionist history of the Holocaust, and in my whole life, I've been thinking about Hitler. Well, at least he died figuring he lost, so that's like the one good thing. And according to this history, his thing was never actually Germany winning the war. He wanted that, but he wasn't really a German nationalist in that way. And it was clear even by 1942 that that Germany was going to lose the war, and he knew it. And he just shifted all his attention to killing the Jews, and that was what mattered most to him. And he considered himself fairly successful, and by the time he killed himself, he felt he'd been pretty successful, and that future generations would look back on him and thank him for it. And it was such a horrible thing. I had to twist in my head that the one satisfaction of thinking this monster had died, considering himself to have failed, and I had to rejigger the story in my head so that he had died thinking of himself as a success. It was just a horrible, horrible thing that has had to twist and turn in my head about the ultimate villain. And I've just been struggling with a new end to the story of that villain that I don't want.
Thanks for sharing that with all of us. There goes my day. Week, month, year.
Should we go to the plane now?
By the way, now you know what lunch is like at the Americans. Yeah.
We're going to go to audience questions a little early in the spirit of getting these guys on their flight. I see someone right here in the second row.
So I'm a big fan of adaptations. How does the process of developing an antagonist change when you've got source material to work with Boyd or Blackjack Randall?
it was an interesting process. I had never done an adaptation before, so I kind of was learning along the way. Blackjack Randall on the page was a little more, it was a simpler character, I found, than the way we wanted to portray him in the show. So it was sort of saying, here's where this character has to go, because the character has a very specific arc within the books, and these are the key elements within it. All right, what else can we add to that? How do we get insight into a character who's going to do these things? So it was sort of just looking for ways to deepen the understanding of Blackjack. We did a whole episode in the first season called The Garrison Commander, where it was basically just Blackjack and Claire in a room. And through that scene, we learned an enormous amount about Blackjack's internal world and how he viewed himself and how he viewed his role and why he did a lot of the things he did. And none of that was in the book, but it was sort of implied that something like that must have happened to him. He must have had some worldview that was similar to that. So it was sort of just taking what was in the book and deciding, okay, how do we enrich this and how do we broaden it out for the audience without violating the fundamental story of where Diana had sent the character?
With Boyd, it was a different thing in that Elmore only wrote him up to the end of the novella, Fire in the Hole, and then we had to make it up from then on. And it was just, basically, it was just trying to stay true to him as best we could. We had a interesting, that was kind of helpful complication in the first season, is that Walton was off doing a movie, so we only could use him a little bit, but he'd taken a bullet, so we had him in hospital, so we could just pop him into a few scenes so we could shoot all at once when we got him back. and then we had to figure out what to do with him the rest of the season. The biggest thing for him was coming up with the notion of Ava and of being in his life, and that he would find that as sort of the one true calling that he had ever had, which I still not entirely sure if he was right. But it was always trying to stay true to Elmore and stay true to the Boyd that he had created. I mean, right from the beginning, we had the issue with him being a white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and Walton didn't want to necessarily play a Southern racist. And so we came up with the notion that fit with Elmore, which is he's just using that. He's just using that as a way to recruit people to go rob banks, because what he likes to do is blow shit up and rob banks. So it was, just following on from what we'd been given was our goal.
Next question, right there.
Your three shows are three of my favorite of all time, and the way Battlestar ended was amazing. And Graham, that last line in what we dug coal together was just a great way to sum it up. So my question for Joel and Joe is, can you give us a hint?
We're going to use Graham's last
this.
line. We dug coal together. That's going to be it. We figure why
But
it worked.
subtitled.
Yeah, but in Russian.
Well, Elizabeth's dad was a coal miner, actually. We probably could use that line.
Well, that's done.
Right, yeah, if you were back there in the white, yeah.
I want to ask an opposite question from earlier. Have you been surprised by characters that you think would be the good guys, like Pastor Tim or even like Skylar White in Breaking Bad, where some of the audiences have otherized them and made them kind of the antagonists?
I think for us, the absolutely most shocking version of that is Paige. There's so many complaints and people writing and saying, what is wrong with this kid? How could she do this to her parents? And we're like, really? What did she do to her parents? We have a lot of trouble following that.
You're right. It was pretty stunning how upset people were with Pastor Tim, who to us seemed to only be trying to reach out and help.
It's a theory. Matt Fowler, who I work with, and I talk about this a lot about why do people hate Skylar, or why did Rita and Dexter and Paige early on, and it's always like if the show has a cool conceit, it's like this is the character that might stop them from doing that thing that the show is about. But yeah, is that an interesting obstacle? Yeah, with Paige, sort of saying like, okay, this is she's just a innocent teenage girl, and then kind of trying to deal with that as you continue on with the show.
Why don't they hate Stan? Stan could stop them too.
Very true. Next question, please. Let's see. I saw someone back there. Come on. Yep, there we go. Right there next.
So I have a question about whenever you have someone that's really good or someone that's really bad that you want to kind of arc them the other way, do you ever feel like you have to do it through flashbacks, or do you prefer not to?
I haven't done it through flashbacks so much that I can recall. When in Battlestar, there were two versions of Sharon in season 1. There was the Sharon that was on Caprica with Hilo, and there was the Sharon that was back on the Battlestar. And at the beginning, we just were fascinated that there were two of them. And it took a couple of episodes before we realized that the arcs were sending them in opposite directions. And we said, oh, let's just keep going along that road. Let's have the bad one go good, the good one go bad, and that'll be an interesting crossover eventually for the two characters. But it just sort of developed as we were developing the stories. We didn't really decide to go back and sort of show you the roots of why they might have done that.
With Battlestar, as you guys went on, by the time the show ended, Cavill kind of carried the burden of I don't know if that's the right term, but he was sort of the face, the antagonist. They had to stop. Do you realize, as you near the end, that and Dean was great in the role, but sort of just you have to have someone sort of specific that they're trying to stop, and because the other characters were very sympathetic by the end. So did you kind of have to think like, okay, who will they really be facing off with?
Yeah, we did have those discussions because we had sort of developed all the Cylon models to a point where it was hard to figure out, well, who among them is suddenly going to be the one really leading the charge against them at the end. But Cavill was naturally in that role and had sort of always been the obstreperous one, even within the Cylon world. So he just kind of fit where the story was going eventually. Yeah.
Yeah, another question? Anyone? Don't
Yeah,
be
if there's
shy.
no questions, we're really going to make our flight. So, I
Well, while you're thinking your question, actually, I have a question for you, Graham, which is on Sneaky Pete and Brian's character, because he is, and I promise you'll make your flight. Hope I'm right about that. Brian's character, because, especially coming off Breaking Bad, which was a character that was, while he was a outwardly good guy going down this bad path we knew a lot about, he's playing the heavy here. He's playing what you would just, you could say is a mobster, but we still get, his backstory as a cop. We still see that he, has love for someone, that he doesn't quite understand what she really thinks of him. So even though it feels like Brian's having a ball playing this character, did you also talk about, well, he can't just be that nasty guy shooting people?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is how we started this conversation, is you're going to spend time with these characters and you have to give them something. And you're just trying to find out a little bit more about who they are. That, it was an early writing lesson for me. A producer on a film said, remember this guy isn't the bad guy in his own movie. And it's something I should have realized, but I hadn't. Anyway, it was, so with Vince, it was just a matter of trying to figure out, well, what got him to this point? And then, then Ben Cavell at the end of the 4th episode wrote a, 10-page monologue for him. And he wrote, it wasn't that long, but it was close. It was about 6 or 7 pages. And we said, Ben, man, it can't be that long. You got to trim it down. And he trimmed it down to about 4 pages. And the problem is Bryan Cranston is one of the producers of the show as well, so he'd already read the long one, had already started memorizing it, had spent like hours and hours just going through it and figuring it out and finding the structure to it. And so we did the long version. And, I say this all the time, please don't tell Ben, but it was great. So.
Question right there.
Take networks and studios aside, what has been the biggest moral argument that the writers' room has had? Like, on morality of whatever main character or side character you guys had?
On Battlestar, we had a pretty intense argument in the writers' room on an episode where they had developed, the colonialists had essentially developed a virus that could wipe out the Cylons. It was like it was the Cylon equivalent to a biological weapon. And the question of whether they were justified in using that against the Cylons, given everything that had happened, that the Cylons had committed genocide against them and were still pursuing them and trying to wipe out the entire human race, and whether or not the colonialists, given that tool of some genocidal weapon to use against their enemy, whether that was the right thing or wrong thing to do, and how the characters should stand on it. It was a pretty intense debate, and we went back and forth, and it got kind of heated at certain points because it just like touched on some pretty raw nerves, and that's like the only one I can really recall from my Battlestar days.
I don't know. I remember us having arguments about. I don't even know if they were arguments or just very intense discussions about would Philip sleep with Kimmy. So I think that was essentially a moral argument.
Wow. Wow. They've killed so many people and folded bodies into suitcases.
We talked about genocide. Everyone's
and everything
nodding.
like that. Yeah, okay.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you say that because at the end of the day, we also found that the audience, for all the killing and all the suitcases, the audience was far more upset about everything with Martha than they ever were about anybody he ever killed.
and that, as in most of these things in life, I think we had broken that story pretty far ahead, but because of the way it unfolded slowly. So, of course, you're not feeling so upset about what Philip's doing with Martha in the first couple episodes, but boy, you get a couple years into that marriage, and it starts to feel a little skeevy, doesn't it?
I think, and being a fan and someone involved in the Americans, so this is going to sound incredibly self-congratulatory, but I've got like nothing to do with the stories. That the Martha story was to me one of the most affecting because it really brought us into the fact that Philip and Elizabeth are not sociopaths, and that they actually developed great feeling for the people they're running, and that to a degree Philip really did love her. And to me, it's things like that. It's not a redemptive thing. It's just the reality of the people who do those jobs that they're not crazy nutballs. They are people who have really torn loyalties. And I'm talking too much, and if we don't get on the plane, that's going to be my fault.
What made you decide not he would not sleep with Kimmy? Like, how did you guys decide on that after all the discussion?
I think ultimately it was more a characterological question than a moral question. It really had to do with how Philip was going to handle that situation and what he could bear more than what we could bear.
Right. Okay, last questions. These guys can make their flight right there.
Some of you have mentioned bureaucracy as a force in your shows, and I'm curious about this idea of like an institution as the enemy or antagonist. Do you think of an institution? Do you think an institution can be an enemy, or is that just a weapon through which the antagonists or enemies of your shows, a weapon they use to carry out their goals?
I mean, for us, it's a great force, on both sides. Particularly, it's easiest to see it on the Soviet side as the whole system being enthralled or enthralled to this kind of immovable bureaucracy that's dictating so much. But Stan also is working for a big bureaucracy that has a lot of force and dictates how espionage in general is run in a kind of nonsensical manner. So everybody really in the work life of our characters is sort of a pawn being shaped by a bureaucracy. I don't think we ever thought of it ourselves as bureaucracy is the enemy so much as a sort of giant moving force.
And really quick, as writers, when you're coming up with the bureaucracy as the bad guy, you have to personify it in terms of a character. And as soon as you do that, then you start to understand it. And you realize that this bureaucracy is composed of, there's a certain culture and a history and all of that, but it is individual people who are doing their jobs, and, they don't set out to be the bad guy.
I'll just add, I think that it's a really interesting question, because one of the terrifying things that a bureaucracy can do at its worst is it divorces human beings from the results of their actions, and it takes away their responsibility for them. And on the Americans, anyway, you have Philip and Elizabeth, who are the tip of the spear of bureaucracy, and they're the ones who are forced to experience both the horrific acts and the results of them. And I think that's been helpful to us dramatically.
Well, guys, we're going to wrap up a little bit, just a couple minutes early here, get these guys on their flight. But thank you so much for coming out. Thank these guys for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.